Hello and welcome to this video on growing economies. In this series of videos in theme 4 business, we're going to be looking at globalization. So we're going to start off with what globalization means as a concept. And globalization is the idea that the world is becoming increasingly integrated. So ideas can flow more freely between different countries, people can flow more easily between different countries, and so can trade. So goods and services can flow more easily between different countries, as well as capital, so finance, money and things like that. That process, which has been undergone over the last 40 years or so, we would describe as globalization. From a business's perspective, the process of globalization has allowed businesses to produce goods or services pretty much anywhere in the world using raw materials, components, capital, and technology from anywhere and sell the resulting output anywhere and then place the profits anywhere. So it's the idea that the world is becoming increasingly like a single economy, and these big global businesses can base their production anywhere, sell their products anywhere, and then move the profits anywhere. This is what we would describe as being a globalized world. So globalization has created significant opportunities for businesses to sell their goods and services overseas. However, at the same time, it's also led to significant increases in global competition and some risks. And that's what we're going to look at in these series of videos. So to start off with, in this first video, we're going to look at what is meant by emerging economies and how their economic performance compares with the UK. And then we're going to look at the implications of growing economies for individuals and for businesses. So let's start off by looking at different types of economy, and we're going to start with what a developed economy is. Now, a developed economy is a country that we would normally describe as having a high level of income per person, a high level of per capita income or gross domestic product, which we learned about in theme 2. We would describe these countries as being industrialized. So they have gone through a process where their economies have moved from primary sector types of products, so commodities, raw materials, and now are more based on manufacturing and more latterly services, tertiary sector, things like banking and insurance and marketing and so on. We would describe them as having a good general standard of living. We would say that they have effective infrastructure. So these places work in terms of transports, networks and healthcare and clean water and things like that. And then we might also look at them in terms of non-economic factors such as good levels of education, literacy and health. By contrast, we group some economies as being emerging economies. And what do we mean by that? Well, we would describe emerging economies as being economies in the process of rapid growth, so catching up the developed economies, and going through a process of industrialization, moving more away from primary sector and towards secondary and some even towards tertiary sector industries. So emerging economies are economies that are making a transition, and they're going through a period of rapid industrialization. They have the potential to become developed economies, but maybe are not quite there yet. Importantly, they've got faster long-term economic growth than most developed countries, although many inhabitants are still in poverty, although that is increasingly less the case. Now, what is important is we appreciate the difference in growth rates of these two economies. So here we have a chart that shows UK GDP growth rate for the last 10 years. And what we can see is that GDP, the value of what's produced within the UK economy, has been growing kind of on average maybe by 0.5%, 0.5% per year over a significant period of time. Here, obviously, we have the recession caused by the financial crisis, but a long-term trend average would be about 0.5% UK GDP growth. So how does that compare with the growth rates of emerging economies? Well, here we're looking at the same data, but the green line shows us the rates of growth for emerging and developing economies. And what we can see is the long-term trend is around 5%. So what this is telling us is they've got a much faster, much higher rate of economic growth. The level of output within these economies is growing much more significantly and has been doing for the past 10 years. And so this will have implications for how their economy is performing and also for businesses choosing where to locate and the process of globalization. Now, a group of emerging economies that we need to know about are called the BRICS economies. And BRICS is an acronym that stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And this group of countries are particularly significant for the global economy as they account for a large number of people, resources, and GDP throughout the world. To back that up, some stats here. These countries combined account for 42% of the world's population, so a very large amount of the potential workers and consumers. Nearly a quarter, or just over a quarter, of the world's land territory, so accounting again for a large amount of the resources available in the world. And again, slightly over a quarter of the world's total GDP, and this number has been rising significantly over the last decade. So these are very significant players in the global market. They're growing very quickly, they're very large, and so very important for businesses to consider this group of countries. Some more stats to back up their importance. Again, we've got the breakdown of GDP in the middle here. It's interesting to look at the fact that they account for a large proportion of all the products traded around the world. Some significant figures down here in terms of foreign direct investment. So lots of foreign companies investing in these markets. They account again for a large amount of trade, so a large number of imports and exports across these markets, and have built up significant financial reserves through exporting products around the world. They are particularly significant countries and have a lot of influence in terms of global politics and global trade. And this is increasingly so. So you might want to pause the video for a second, have a little look through some more of the data here, and just trying to appreciate the importance of the BRICS countries as a group. Okay, it's important not just to consider their impact in terms of manufacturing, and sometimes we imagine these are kind of slightly old-fashioned economies, perhaps, or just manufacturing low-value items and doing kind of pens and textiles and things like that. They're also growing in terms of their sophistication and in terms of the tertiary sector and things like online and e-commerce. So, for example, across the BRICS countries, there are 403 million people who are e-shopping, which is nearly 7 times the population of the UK. There is a very significant amount of e-commerce going on across these economies. So they are developing rapidly and becoming more industrialized. Not only that, but also moving into kind of more technology-based areas as well. So again, you might want to pause this chart, possibly print it out, but again, try and get an appreciation of the fact that these economies are becoming particularly relevant in terms of e-commerce as well as just manufacturing. A second group of emerging economies that we should be familiar with are known as the MINT economies, and here MINT stands for Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. And the MINT economies are considered to be the second kind of tier or the second wave of emerging economies that are going to be significant and very important for the global economy. If we look at GDP in 2012, we can see that Mexico 14th, Indonesia 16th, Turkey 17th, Nigeria 39th, largest economies. Why they're so important is that in terms of estimated GDP by 2050, all these countries will have moved into the top 15. So there are a second wave of countries behind Brazil, Russia, India, China that are going to become increasingly important for the global economy. So we've got the BRICS and the MINT countries. Okay, so we've looked at emerging economies and how their economic performance compares with the UK. We're now going to look at the implications of these growing economies for individuals and particularly businesses. So these growing economies present many business opportunities. So for example, there's a growing number of educated middle-class consumers, and these types of consumers are particularly important because they have higher disposable income and are a significant driver of growing consumer spending. Demand is likely to be income elastic in these countries. As incomes rise, there is an even greater increase in demand for products, as it's maybe the first time they've had access to these products and the markets aren't saturated. Again, there is cultural shifts taking place within these economies, and this presents opportunities, maybe high demand for personalized products, personal care products, high demands for private education, high demands for healthcare treatments, and all of these present opportunities for businesses. Again, there's increased demand for infrastructure, new railways, ports, bridges, roads, broadband, and other products and services from developed economies that present opportunities for businesses in developed economies. Again, there's an opportunity here for businesses to use highly skilled but potentially lower cost labor within the emerging markets. So using the process of outsourcing, maybe hiring or paying a company in an emerging market to produce for you, or offshoring, maybe relocating your production facilities to another country where it is a lower cost labor, but still maybe have the same skill set. And finally, there is greater potential for joint ventures or for acquisitions of companies within these emerging markets and for those to be successful. So plenty of business opportunities from emerging markets. A particularly important one for potential markets is the growth of the global middle class. So there's been a real increase in middle class populations within countries like China and India. And that is important because as they move into the middle class, their consumption, their purchasing of goods and services increases dramatically. And if we look at kind of the current state of affairs, the majority of the world's middle class reside in Japan, United States, EU, kind of Western developed economies. If we fast forward 40, 50 years, or to 2050, the majority of the middle class consumers in the world will belong in China, India, and other Asian emerging economies. So it's important for businesses to consider that change in the demographic, or the change in the spending patterns around the world, and to potentially position themselves to take advantage of that within these markets. Some more opportunities. Well, emerging markets, as they emerge and become more developed, are opening up new markets for businesses to target. There is increasing wealth in these countries, such as China, who, as they move into the middle class, want to purchase Western brands. And in particular, British brands have a strong provenance in these markets in terms of fashion, in terms of finance, cars, the arts, education. Also, it gives businesses access to raw materials. So if you think potentially of oil, large developed economies, oil companies, Shell, BP, have facilities in emerging markets so they can access the raw materials there. And again, there are greater investment opportunities as these countries emerge and they open up and become more part of the global economy. So what might be some of the threats from emerging markets? Well, an increasingly large pool of skilled but low-cost labour means that there may be either more competition from businesses within those markets that can take advantage of that low-cost labour, or potentially a relocation and some of the issues that come about with relocation or offshoring or even outsourcing to do with logistics and coordination. So that's one threat. Some emerging countries, like China, undervalue their currencies to make their exports cheaper. So this provides a source of strong competition for developed economies, companies and businesses. Inadequate protection of brand and other intellectual property. So because they don't necessarily recognize patents and trademarks in the way that developed economies do, a lot of businesses in emerging markets can borrow ideas or just base their ideas on developed economies products and create very similar items. And lastly, in many emerging markets, the government provide businesses who operate there with money to make them more competitive globally, which companies in developed economies don't always receive. Okay, some key risks of investing in emerging markets. Well, political instability. There have been examples in countries such as Russia, where political instability has meant that some joint ventures involving businesses from developed economies haven't worked out, and this is an ongoing risk until these countries become more stable politically. Cultural differences and sensitivities. So a lot of developed economies businesses have tried to enter emerging markets like China, but because they don't understand the culture of business or they don't understand the culture of the consumers, they find it very difficult to pitch their goods and services or to make successful joint ventures in those countries. Again, variable approaches to financial and legal dealings. So understanding the legal system in India may be challenging to businesses who are used to operating in the legal system in the UK. Corruption and bureaucracy is still an issue in many emerging markets. So the need for bribes or very slow processes to get things done can frustrate the efforts of businesses from developed economies. And emerging markets becoming major exporters in their own rights, and their own businesses competing heavily with developed economy companies that invest in that particular market make things risky. All of this process of globalization and this emergence of these emerging economies have had impacts on employment patterns. So if we have a look at unemployment rates around the world, we can see potentially higher rates of unemployment in Southern Europe, for example, than in say many emerging economies like India, China, and Russia. And so this relocation of employment that we've seen over the last decade has had an impact. Although it's not true of all industries, you would argue it's mainly been true of manufacturing rather than tertiary sector services. So businesses need to consider carefully the pros and cons of what this suggests. High unemployment in a particular area may suggest it's going to be cheaper to employ the workforce, but also if there's high unemployment in that area, it might also mean that there is low demand in that area. So businesses have to consider employment patterns and the changing rates of employment around the world when they're developing their strategies of where to base themselves and where to sell their products. So in this video, we've looked at emerging economies and their economic performance, and we've looked at the implication of these emerging and growing economies for individuals and businesses. That's it. Thanks very much.